The United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15, ended in Canada last week with the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF. Now, this is a key agreement to guide global action on nature through to 2030. Representatives from 188 countries gathered in Montreal for the important summit, including young people from different parts of the world. Now, one of them was maritime lawyer and ocean economy activist Osiphesona Ngcanga, who's from the Eastern Cape. I spoke to him soon after his return from the conference. Osiphesona, talk to us a little bit about the experience itself, being there first time and being amongst global players.
Yes, it was, Peter, it was a really amazing experience, getting people that are like-minded, environmentalists basically in one venue, and actually paving the way for the future of biodiversity. So with the different parties that were involved, also NGOs, I was very excited to see indigenous people as well. And communities, local communities, people, actually there's a full-on representation of the global spectrum. So it was a very exciting experience to actually see all of those people who are very passionate about the environment in one space and actually there with one main goal, and that is to preserve biodiversity.
So how did the negotiations go? I know that they got quite passionate at one point. We even saw some delegates walking out. So it is a passionate issue. How did it go with so many different players with different interests?
Yes, Peter. You find that sometimes it gets very emotional because when you're looking at the whole process, basically it's a legislative process. You're basically drafting policy, world policy. So you find that in any government, you find out in South African government, you've got the judiciary, you've got the executive, and then you've got the legislature. The legislature is in charge for drafting legal documents. So it's a legislative process. So now you'll find that there's a lot of intricacies and it can get very meticulous when it comes to the text. You find that they argue over an hour where a "the" should be or a comma. So one of the things that I saw with the differences in cultures and languages is that a person from Russia who has Russia as a home language, translating something to English is a different type of English when I am also speaking my home language, translating it to English. So you find that there were a bit of discrepancies, which I feel needed a linguistician to be able to, consolidate all of that information. So you'll find that a lot of time was spent with intricacies that were not of really material effect of the legal documentation in its own.
What was the biggest issue on the table? COP27 financing was a big headache. Was it the same at the biodiversity conference?
Most definitely. Most definitely. I expected a unanimous decision whereby we're going to draft this global framework because we're all looking at preserving biodiversity and living in harmony with nature. And I was expecting, with the ambitious efforts of global biodiversity framework, I was expecting sufficient resources to be put on the table to be able to ensure that there's successful implementation of it. Because you'll find that indigenous people make 5% of the world, but then they are in charge of actually 80% of the land that we want to preserve, or the nature that is within that land. So they play a very crucial role within the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. So you find that one of the things, Article 20 of the Convention for Biological Diversity actually puts an obligation on developed countries to be able to provide resources to developing countries to be able to implement the global biodiversity framework. But you'll find that there was reluctancy, and first countries are actually very defensive when it comes to putting the numbers on the table with regards to providing those resources. So without sufficient resources and with the obligation of Article 20, Africa won't be able to implement all of these ambitious efforts that are within the framework. So resources were a huge issue, and I can't really disclose the country, but there was an African country, there was a lady from Africa representing a certain African country. She actually stood firm. I think we need more women in that process. She actually stood firm that we cannot accept this without a clear mandate with regards to the resources. What resources are you going to put on the table for us to implement it? And she stood strong. And I was very disappointed because she didn't really get support from other leaders of Africa, and we weren't really unified as Africa, because you find that we do get bullied here and there by first world countries when they want to ensure that their provisions are actually implemented within the process. So when we are not as one as Africa, it's very easy for first world countries to dictate the terms. So she stood so firm, and I was very inspired by that woman. And she wasn't really backed up by the other African leaders, and which was I think that's when people started walking out. It was the main issue is resource mobilization.
What about the youth? You're a young person, and often what happens at conferences like this is they invite you, but your voice isn't really heard. Was it different this time around?
Well, we do get sort of a gap. I don't believe that it's big enough for us to talk and be part of the negotiations. But us as the youth, when you're sitting and looking at the whole process, we find that sometimes the cart is actually placed before the horse within our view as a youth, because you find that you're drafting documentation. We are the future custodians of this document. So you're drafting this documentation without adequate input from the youth. So now you're going to expect us to be able to implement a documentation that we are not part of forming in the first place. So we're not going to have the right drive and vigor to be able to implement it if we're not part of the process. So us as the youth of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which is a global network of youth and NGOs and organizations, we were sitting there and we're actually pushing to actually be involved. We have to be more involved within these processes. So we are not happy with the youth representation within the COPs in general.
So how do you change this? What do you do? Because the planet, particularly Africa, is predominantly young. Average age, I think 19 and a half or something like this. So if you're not getting enough of a voice, how do you change this?
You see, Peter, it's very interesting that you mentioned, because I was actually engaging with members of the European Union. I was mentioning to them that in Africa, the median age is 19. In Europe, the median age is 42. In Asia, I believe it's 32. It's the same actually as South America. So you find that within Africa, you have the youngest population in the whole world. So basically there you have future custodians who are going to be able to drive the Convention for Biological Diversity forward, and actually the framework to be able to implement it. Now, if the youth is not properly involved within the process, and I repeated to them, if the youth is not involved within the process, we're going to be sitting with the documents that we're not going to be willing to implement because we're not part of the process. So you need to include the youth more in the processes, and you need to include our fresh train of thought, because there's certain ideas that we actually wanted to put on the table with regards to the processes that will actually make the process shorter and more effective within its efficacy. So yeah, that was the one issue that we had, but we were radical in some places. We were like, we need to speak, we need to speak out, and we remained unsullied in the midst of iniquity.
All right, so a framework was signed, was agreed on the last day after a lot of negotiation. What does it mean for the continent and for South Africa in particular?
Well, to be honest, one of the contentious issues that we raised is that was an issue with regards to the document was I believe it was target 3 that deals with protected areas. So we basically postulated to the first world countries that there's certain things that you have to take into consideration with regards to protected areas. We have to take into consideration our goals to develop the third world countries. We have to take into consideration the indigenous people and the goals that the country has, third world country has. So as much as we want to implement the 30 by 30, but then we have to take into consideration the people, because most of the time they're excluded from the resources. So that was one of the issues that we were kind of disappointed that it wasn't addressed in efficacy. And you find that with regards to the technological transfers from first world countries to us, technological cooperation with regards to the training and consultation. So we found that the resources were not adequately put on the table for us third world countries to be able to drive the 30 by 30 forward. So you'll find that it was an analogy I drew with, I was invited to lunch by members of SADC. It was an analogy I drew that first world countries are driving a Ferrari, we're driving a 1938 Beetle. They're driving on a race course. We're driving on a gravel road. We have the same distance, but then we expected to get there at the same time. You get what I'm saying? So obviously we won't be able to get there at the same time if we will ever be able to get there. So it's very ambitious efforts, but then without sufficient resources, we won't be able to get to where we want to get to.
Perhaps as we start to conclude this conversation, let's take a look forwards. And I just wonder what we need to do in this country and on the continent, because I'm not always convinced that our authorities are fully on board, fully understanding of the amount of work that's required to protect our biodiversity across the continent.
Yes, I mean, Peter, it's one of the issues that I raised actually in that lunch with SADC was that, no, it was actually with Expertise France. I was saying to them that if you don't feel like you own something, if let's say it's a phone, if you don't feel like you own the phone, you won't really take care of it. And if you don't know the value of it, you will abuse it. So basically, I believe that society needs to be conscientized more of the importance of biodiversity towards the future and living in harmony with nature. So if they don't understand the purpose of it, without understanding the purpose, you'll abuse the whole process and the implementation. So with them, they are aloof. A lot of them are aloof about environmental matters. So it needs people like us, for instance, with Youth in Your Oceans, we actually educate the young youth about these processes. We educate them about the importance of marine biodiversity. We do consultations with them. So we're basically working on the ground with the people, conscientizing them so that we get a generation that's growing up that are actually conscious about the importance of the environment. Because currently, people don't really know the importance of the environment and of these processes, those lengthy processes that we sit through in order to draft the global biodiversity framework.